Hey, everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is me, your host, Preacher Master, host of the SOS Shout Out Show. Thank you for joining us on yet another Saturday, man. You know, I am so happy to just get the Saturday and Fridays these days because I don't know why. Maybe I didn't appreciate them before, maybe because I was working on the road or you're grinding so hard that even when you get to the weekend is just setting up the rest of your week. And many of us are like that. Many of us had tunnel vision. Many of us have, it's not tunnel vision. You have a concept, an idea, without necessarily, if you will, brothers and sisters, having an end to your vision. Today's show that I'm going to speak on, now this is not, I don't think I've done a show like this. I don't think I've even had a lecture like this. I waited some time till after the passing of Congressman John Lewis. Uh, Everyone's familiar with John Lewis. You know, everybody's seen his documentary that came out. People read his book, March. We all know about Selma. You know, and everyone gave him, in a large regard, they gave him his roses before he passed away. But I didn't want to give him his roses. I wanted to justify, if you will. I wanted to give this man vindication for the many things that he saw that many of us did not see, many of us haven't seen, and many of us will never see. What John Lewis gave us, brothers and sisters, was an extension beyond the civil rights era of Martin Luther King. Now, hold that thought. I don't want you to think that I'm disrespecting King. That's not true. What I'm saying is, from that era, there were no real John Lewises. There were no real central core people in terms of strategy, in terms of philosophy, in terms of execution than John Lewis. I saw something on, someone sent me something. It was on C-SPAN some many years ago. It was celebrating Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. And I think at this point in time, he's sort of like at the end of his life, the cancer had kind of gotten in there. And he had a thing that happened in the Capitol. It was organized, I believe, it was actually organized by Minister Louis Farrakhan. And it had a lot of luminaries there. It had Farrakhan, it had Imam Jamil Al-Amin, who was sitting right next to Stokely Carmichael. They had a lot of people there. Let's just call it what it is. It was a who's who of Black liberation. Of course, I'm talking about this is in the 70s, if you will. What was interesting was the speech that John Lewis gave. It's a lovely speech. It talked about Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, but it gave a little bit of an insight into what the civil rights movement really was, number one, and number two, how he evolved out of the civil rights movement. And I'm talking about SNCC, Student Nonviolent Action Committee. We're talking SNCC, and I think this is something that I don't want to overlook and I don't want to glance over, because at that presentation, you were looking at some of the last of the prominent freedom fighters. Let me say that again. The last of some of the prominent freedom fighters. Now, let me explain. Some years ago, I was doing warm up. I was about to shoot the Allah Made Me Funny film, Allah Made Me Funny live in concert. It was at a little jazz club in Washington, D.C. I think it was on 16th Street. I can't remember. It was a downstairs jazz club. HR 57 was the name of it, as a matter of fact. And I was working on my set, and we had a little comedy club downstairs, jazz club upstairs. Horrible optics, horrible auditory thing. But I looked over to my left while I was performing, and I saw then Congressman Elijah Cummings. And I acknowledged him from the stage. And he was kind enough to talk to me afterwards. And I was telling him, you know, I followed the work you've done in Baltimore, blah, blah, blah. And we talked about this. We talked about Allah Made Me Funny. We talked about Muslim image, Muslims in Baltimore, the Muslims he knew back in the 60s. And we got to talking about freedom movements. And he stopped. He said, if you're going to talk about freedom movements with me, he says, I got 5 words for you. He said, John Lewis, do your homework. John Lewis, do your homework. And what I understood from what he was saying was, as much as I was talking to him, I was grossly unprepared to have a large conversation about what the freedom movements were back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. You heard me say 50s, okay? 50s, 60s, 70s on up. What Elijah Cummings was telling me was, A, while I was lauding all this attention on him and celebrating him and this thing, he reminded me that the battle was not over. He reminded me that there was still work to be done. And in a like way with John Lewis, I realized why I always enjoyed seeing John Lewis. And check this out. This is why I enjoyed seeing John Lewis. Because he reminded me to never feel comfortable. Much the same as Dick Gregory would talk about being in the civil rights movement and being in the club now, and he would talk about the movement, all the people. Dick Gregory, like John Lewis, reminded me to never feel comfortable. Just the idea that we can argue about discrimination in schools and on the workplace and things like that, it comes from people like John Lewis. It comes from those soldiers, those foot soldiers, if you will, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that laid that path so you can even have an understanding or a cohesive argument about attending a school, and it was integrated. John Lewis didn't go to integrated schools. He didn't go to integrated schools. In fact, you probably know this, but he attended a seminary. American Baptist Theological Seminary, and it was in Nashville. And he was attending there. He was studying to be a preacher. He was going to be a minister. And he disturbed his studies to apply to an all-white school in Troy, Alabama. Now, he had no intention to go there. He just said that, I want to be the first one to walk through there and take something out. I want to take your education out. The education you've been getting everybody else, I want to take that education out. And obviously, he was going to give it to everybody else. And they didn't allow him to do that. And he got so frustrated that he wrote a letter to a young man. His name was Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King heard about this young man. He sent a round-trip ticket for him to come from Nashville to Montgomery and go back. Now, the rest of it is history, folks. But let me explain why I'm doing an open letter to John Lewis. I'm doing an open letter to John Lewis. Number one, to say, not that I appreciated you, John Lewis, Brother Lewis, Big Brother Lewis. I want to say that I underestimated you. I didn't give you full credit for the genius that you were bringing to the table. I underestimated you. As much as I celebrate you, there's still aspects of this thing that is still unfolding. Even in depth, he's making more and more sense now. So this open letter is not just a thank you. It's an acknowledgement of strategy. He had a wonderful concept, because people get tied up on John Lewis talking about, get into good trouble, good trouble, good trouble. Yes, but that's a strategy, brothers and sisters. You've got to be willing to lay down your life to get into the type of struggle that he's talking about. Many of us are not there. Many of us are not there. His idea of protest is that the symbol, the sign that you are there may be that you may lose your life. Many of us are not there. The idea of protest is that his footprint may be that he may never even leave a footprint. A gentleman that was arrested over 40 times. He's one of the few people I know that went to penitentiary for 15 days. Not jail, penitentiary. And when you begin to unravel it, particularly in these times, I want you to slow down. I want everybody to do a little independent case study of John Lewis. John Lewis, brothers and sisters, was an OG. What do I mean about OG? This is a man who, for all intents and purposes, probably should have been our first black president. I say should have been. Would we have voted for him? Now, I don't know that. I don't know if he went, but I'm saying he should have been. And let me tell you why he was not. Because he understood the balance of giving up everything he had established to go pursue this goal. Very few people realize how important it is to play your position. Let me say it again and give a shout out. Sister Christy Sania, walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Very few people understand the science, number one, the discipline, number two, and the execution, number three, of playing your position. See, John Lewis was ambitious, but it's a different kind of ambitious. It's not a Trump ambitious. It's not a Biden ambitious. It's not Obama ambitious. This is a gentleman that had foresight during those times, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And let me even emphasize this even more. He had the foresight when black folk got the vote, the Civil Rights Act, he was a grown man. Okay? He had done over 20 years in Jim Crow segregation. We talk about institutional racism. We throw it out there that quickly. This is institutional racism, okay? But back then, it was just the way it was. It was enforceable whenever, however, wherever, and there was nothing you can do about it. We talk about, I can't breathe. That's serious. I'm talking about George Floyd. You're talking about a generation of people that couldn't breathe. John Lewis was one of them. And his genius, though, he's several of them. One of his geniuses, though, was that he had a subtle way of letting you know, an extremely subtle way of letting you know, that the people with the foot on your neck, and we say we can't breathe, he had a subtle way of letting us know that the people who are oppressing us, they definitely can't breathe. He was one of the first people that put in my heart, along with King and Malcolm X, and even Elijah Muhammad, put in my heart that you're dealing with folks with dead hearts. You say, when you talk about John Lewis, it's two aspects. And make sure, in my open letter to John Lewis, I want to understand, and I want to say, I understand that you worked in two levels. Number one, you were a social advocate. You did social activism. And number two, you were a civil rights advocate. Let me explain it. The social and the civil. The social and the civil. The social had a lot to do with social conditions. It had to do with the conditions of African Americans in the United States. But he doesn't stop there. This is the beauty of him and people like King. He bends the rules of rules that have already been broken. So you know how hard it is to bend a rule that's already been broken? He did that. And why I'm saying that is because he looked to the core of what the problems were with the oppressor. He looked to the core of what the problems were with the oppressor. That's why the civil rights movement and SNCC and Selma, they were all organic. When I say organic, the people who responded with force and hate, they had no other way to engage this process. They had never seen it before. You know, one of my favorite scenes from Training Day with Denzel Washington, he yells, this isn't, we ain't playing chess, we're playing checkers. You ain't playing checkers, we're playing chess. And you heard it saying before, this ain't checkers, this is chess. Do you know the ability of a John Lewis to invite people in to play checkers, beat them at checkers, educate them on why they got beat at checkers, then take them to chess and say, let's expand what we're doing. Very few people are going to do that. We're in the era, brothers and sisters, where you're not looking at freedom fighters anymore. You're not really looking at freedom movements anymore. They're popular movements, but they're not freedom movements. When I say they're not freedom movements, because the failure is they're not liberating the oppressors. You take a person like a John Lewis, you roll them in a ball. You roll them in a ball. And if you put them and roll them in any situation in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 90s, all the way up to now, they're going to have a place and it's going to be a strategic expression. Remember what Elijah Cummings said to me when I talked about freedom and liberation movements. He said 5 words. He said, John Lewis, do your homework. John Lewis was supposed to be a preacher. If you ever read his biography, and I would encourage you to, and if you have read it, read it again. He was built for the movement. He was built for the movement. Now, I'm not taking anything away from anybody, but the way society is stacked and fragmented and inorganic and contradictory and selfish, I see no one who's built for the times. I see no one that's built for the times. John Lewis was built for the times. He talked about his parents. Now, he's the third of 10 children. The third of 10 children. He wasn't the youngest. He's the third of 10 children. His parents were sharecroppers. Now, hold on to that thought, because I want to explain to you what sharecropping is. Sharecropping is one level above slavery. When I say one level above slavery, it means that you may have been liberated as a slave. You may have worked hard and gotten some money. But the people were not going to let you make money without them. When I say the people, I mean the oppressors. So you may have the land, if you will. But these people came up with a whole scheme whereby you would become indebted to them just to farm your land. You would wind up borrowing equipment because guess what? The laws were there where black folks couldn't borrow money. So you're in a debt relationship. So to till your soil, you got to buy their equipment. So number one, you have to pay for equipment to be marked up. And then on top of that, they want a portion of what you went out there and they want a portion of your harvest. Now, this is not new. But for John Lewis, clearly in his young age, he said, I'm not going to be a sharecropper. I'm not going to put out effort and idea that can be compromised by the people that I'm fighting against. When I say that, you're talking about a very special individual. So yes, this letter to John Lewis, an open letter, if you will. And I say it's open because it's not just me. Whoever's watching, have your own open letter to John Lewis. You know why? Because we have run the table of our freedom fighters. One thing that always stood funny to me was that John Lewis was built for this. He was a farm boy. He was a country boy down in Alabama. And he tells the story how he was young. He was dedicated to the ministry, and in his chicken coop, if you will, he would line up all the chickens and the hens and the roosters, and he would preach to them. He would preach the word. And then actually, a lot of you guys don't know, you probably do, but his nickname was, like yours truly, Preacher. But one thing that I will say about John Lewis, and I want everyone to listen to this because it's very, very, very lucid thought. John Lewis thought 20 to 25 years ahead of everybody. That's the one thing Elijah Cummings said. He said John Lewis was not a 2 or 3 year. He saw it years ahead of everybody. Being one of the first freedom riders to go down to New Orleans, leading these marches. People don't understand. He led marches. He didn't have backup. You've heard me reference Dr. Vernon Johns. He was sort of like the predecessor before Martin Luther King, but he didn't have these guys led events, led actions, and they didn't have support. They were beaten, they were assaulted, damn near killed, but they were never stopped. And in that space, brothers and sisters, in that space, this guy turns history around. The march of 600 people over the Pettit Bridge, Bloody Sunday, was orchestrated. He was a master mover of pieces in social reality. Yes, John Lewis, I'm going to say it right here. You were a social scientist. You weren't a politician. I know nothing of your voting record. I don't have to look at it. I know that the social activist piece and the civil activist piece are very, very important. Because one, social activism had a lot to do with African Americans, but civil. Bringing an argument to people about civility is a very, very difficult task. Now, like I said, if you ever got a slogan from John Lewis, it's going to say good trouble, good trouble, good trouble, good trouble. And that's fine. Say good trouble. But there's something that he talked about, that it can't be overlooked. I think it may even be bigger than the whole idea of, good trouble, if you will. He had a concept, brothers and sisters, called beloved community. The beloved community. And I went back and forth, like, what is this beloved community? This gentleman had the foresight to understand that the oppressor, if you will, whether you like them or not, whether you agree with them or not, they still were going to be your neighbor. We're not talking quality of neighbor, if you're a good neighbor or a bad neighbor. What he's saying is, it's still going to be your neighbor. And you can get all the legislation that you want to, but it doesn't cause any increase of empathy or concern or sympathy. It doesn't necessarily turn their heart. And that's what John Lewis made a difference for me. He reminded me, with this whole idea of the beloved community, that how much I love for myself and my people, I have to, at some point in time, despite I may not like you, agree with anything you say, I have to wish the same for you as well. And I have to advocate for it, even though you may feel as though it's not in your best interest. You may feel that it's anti what you're talking about. When we get to that point, folks, we're not talking about a politician. You're not really talking about a politician. You know what you're talking about? You're talking about somebody who walks, talks, converses, laughs, cries, prays to God. My open letter to John Lewis, it's a thank you letter, but it's an acknowledgement. John Lewis, in his 80 years, helped me realign so many ideas about community. Helped me realign so many ideas about race. It helped me identify the fact that I never want to be equal to people who are hurting, because I can't help them and I can't help myself. Therefore, it's imperative that we take these systemic high roads to exemplify to people that, yes, despite everything that you may see, everything you may have done to me, everything you may have tried to do to me, I'm still in an elevated space and my mind is clear and it's not thinking about you and your present condition. It's not thinking about you and your intentions. These intentions, this strategy is coming from someplace else. And that, brothers and sisters, is the magic of John Lewis or C.T. Vivian. We celebrate Martin Luther King, but we don't celebrate oftentimes enough, if you will, the foot soldiers. You see, King died in 1968. John Lewis died in 2020. He never stopped working. They always say, hey, when you finish a task, go to the next one. And I believe that. But we don't understand task versus mission. It's very hard to go from one mission to the next mission. You can go to the next task, but a mission, something totally different. And I extol some of the virtues that Mr. Lewis talked about seeing something. See, that's the simplicity of it. When you see something, you do something. See, that's really from the 60s. And we could talk about all the things he did, some of the pilot programs to feed young, hungry black children. He realized they needed nutrition. This is before the 70s with the Black Panthers. He did it. He recognized that. And of course, when you got to the 70s and had the free lunch program, it wasn't by mistake. He continually put out information and examples for people to look around, assess themselves, and establish what do I need to create, if you will, this beloved community. And as I close, I want to say this about Mr. John Lewis. Whatever goes down with the African American community, minority communities, what I learned is, and I will say this over and over, what I learned was you always have the power to have a beloved community. And that power to have a beloved community, it begins and ends with the idea that you are empowered. You are the ones that distribute love. You are the ones that distribute compassion. For those that don't need it or don't want it, they won't come near it anyway. But if they do, the power needs to be there because they have to be able to see that they themselves, one, are not part of a beloved community, but two, given an opportunity and correction, they could be. Brothers and sisters, Preacher Moss, this is my open letter to John Lewis. I thank you. I respect you. I appreciate your service. As a black man, I love your model. And as a brother, I love you. Everybody, have a wonderful Saturday and see you tomorrow on the ShOUT Show. I had another announcement, but you know what? I'm going to let that go. Let's just kind of marinate on Brother Lewis, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hey everybody, this is your brother Preacher Moss. Listen, I hope that you enjoyed your ShOUT Show experience. We'll be back with the next show, the next ShOUT Show. A simple ask before you go, please help your brother out. Click that subscribe button, click that notify button, and I'll see you again on this side of the microphone. You probably wonder what that smell is. That's me. I smell good. And the reason I smell good is because I use oils from Tarifa Tar. So I'm not saying you can't smell good. I'm not even saying you stink. I'm saying you have the opportunity to smell exquisite. Check out tarifatar.com for some of the best oils and scents in town.